Welcome back to the Policy Viz podcast. I'm your host, John Schwabish. I hope your 2025 is off to a good start. I hope you're enjoying the show so far. I've got another great episode for you this week. I chat with Svelte creator and developer Rich Harris. If you are unfamiliar with Svelte, don't worry about it. You're going to learn all about it in this episode, but you're not just going to learn about the tool itself. So don't worry if you're not a programmer, you're not a coder. This episode is also for you because you're going to learn about how Rich thinks about the web, how Rich thinks about developing open source tools and the responsibility he has as the creator and developer of this kind of tool. So we talk a lot about different aspects of data visualization, and the web more broadly. And so I think you're really going to enjoy this episode, regardless of whether you're a developer, whether you're a data visualization creator, or whether you are just a user of the web and of DataViz. So with no further ado, here is my interview, my discussion with Rich Harris of Svelte. Hey, Rich. Good to meet you. Good, morning, my time.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, very excited to chat with you. Everyone I know who's in the JavaScript D3 Svelte world is very excited about Svelte. And so I was excited to be able to connect. I thought we'd start maybe with just intros and then talk a little bit about like the early development of Svelte and what you're doing now. Just start there. Yeah.
Yeah. So my name is Rich. I'm a software engineer at a company called Svelte, and I work full time on a user interface framework called Svelte. And this is something that I've been working on now for over 8 years. In my previous life as a journalist, I worked in graphics departments at The Guardian US, and the New York Times. And Svelte is a project that came out of the experiences that I had trying to build rich, interactive, data-driven graphics in that environment. Because a lot of people who've dabbled with code, who've tried to do this sort of thing, will know it's really hard.
Yeah.
And Svelte was my attempt to make that easier. I left the New York Times in 2021 and joined Svelte to work on Svelte full time. And against all the odds, it's become this sort of thing that is reasonably widely used in web development, not just in DataViz, but in web development more broadly, to build various different applications. And that's me.
So Svelte is used primarily as let's start with this for folks who don't know. Can you talk about what Svelte does that other similar libraries packages don't do, like D3, for example, is probably what most people who are listening to this podcast sort of think about immediately when it comes to JavaScript, interactive DataViz.
Yeah. So the first thing to know is that D3 and Svelte aren't exactly competitors. They overlap a little bit. They solve some of the same problems, but they're things that you can like very much use together, and a lot of people do. What Svelte is more akin to. A lot of people might have heard of frameworks like React and Vue and Angular, and they all belong to this category of projects that aim to make web development easier by making it essentially more declarative. So in development, we often talk about this dichotomy between imperative programming, where you're telling the computer exactly what to do at any given moment, and declarative programming, where you're sort of defining what the world should look like and then letting the computer figure out the details for you. And so the projects that I've described, React is the most prominent one. It's the one that's most widely used. They give you essentially a framework for describing the application that you're trying to build. D3 is a lot more on the imperative side. You're describing what should happen at any given moment with your data. It's not quite as imperative as coding against the platform directly. Like it gives you this abstraction layer on top of it, but less so than these more general purpose web development frameworks like Svelte and like React. It's a little hard to describe in the context of a podcast exactly what it is, because it's it's a, podcasts are a great medium for having conversations about this stuff, but they're a terrible medium for
Yeah, like
actually
showing something.
showing
Yeah,
people, and you really need to be able to kind of see it to get a
yeah,
feel for what it is. But essentially, when you're building an application using Svelte, you're writing a language that is based on top of HTML. And so a lot of people who dabble in this space know a lot of HTML, know a lot of CSS. And the difference between having that knowledge and being able to write a rich interactive application is, well, those are static languages. They're good for describing sort of static chunks of a page. And then you're sort of you're thrown into the deep end of JavaScript in order to manipulate that in interesting ways and add data and add interactivity. And Svelte is a language that essentially adds interactivity to HTML in a way. And it does this in uh, what we aim to be a very concise and understandable way, so that if you have that background, you know some HTML and you know some CSS, um, you can start building interactive applications without having to like go off the deep end and become
right,
a JavaScript expert.
right. I'm curious how your work at the Guardian and the Times both inspired the development of Svelte and how it was sort of supported by colleagues or management, or like, were was this like part of your core job of like, we need a better toolkit, we need a better solution, or was this you like kind of dabbling off on the side and it kind of picked up steam over time?
Very much the latter. The nice thing about working in newsrooms is that the people who run newsrooms have no idea about any of this stuff. Like, you're very much left to your own devices. And so, like, if you can kind of sit there and work on a tool, and people start to use it organically, then eventually they'll turn around and say, oh yeah, it's like, you can do this, that's
Right.
fine. But there's never a point at which it becomes part of the job description.
Yeah, right,
It's very much a ask forgiveness rather than permission type situation, which
right,
is, completely at odds with how it works in a more traditional development environment. um, and I think probably because of that, rather than in spite of that, newsrooms have historically been really good incubators of open source projects that are actually useful, because they're very much driven by day-to-day needs,
yeah,
as opposed to some, like, for the sake of the project itself. They're
right,
always a means to an end. And so, the New York Times graphics department has produced, or um, like, very much aided the development of things like Svelte, but also D3. Mike
right,
Bostock did a lot of the D3 development work while he was working in the New York Times graphics
yeah,
department. Other projects would include Backbone and Underscore from Jeremy Ashkenass,
yeah,
who a lot of that work also happened at the New York Times graphics department. And there are plenty of examples from other newsrooms, like things like Django, um, have all come out of this same sort of process. Um, and so, yeah, it's been like one of the. I always tell people, like, if you're a developer and you want to be able to do really interesting work with interesting people, then, like, get a job in a newsroom.
right, right. Do you think it was your work in the newsroom? Was it spurred by the storytelling part of journalism? Was it the technical challenges of sort of this? I mean, 8 years ago is not that far into like the modern data viz world, but like, what was from your perspective, like, what was the challenge you were trying to solve? Was it the storytelling piece, or was it just a technical piece of there's got to be a better way or a more efficient way?
It's both. Newsrooms are a very deadline driven culture for obvious reasons. And so you need to build things quickly. Um,
Yeah,
at the same time, like, you're trying to do things that are engaging. Like, the whole point is to reach people and tell them a story in hopefully a way that they haven't seen before, and be able to frame things in a way that is novel and interesting. And when you're trying to to solve both of those constraints, like you start hitting the limits of what you're physically able to do in a certain amount of time,
Yeah.
given the tools that you have. And so we need tools that allow us to move very quickly, that allow us to build, interactive visualizations and so on, that work on mobile devices and don't like slow to a crawl when you open them
Yeah.
and things like that. And candidly, when this project started, the tools that were available just weren't all that great for that. There's lots of ways that you can do sort of off the shelf stuff. Lots of kind of pre-baked charting solutions and things
Yeah.
like that. But if you want to do really novel stuff, then you have to be able to use code. And that's where like all of your ambitions of getting stuff done by a particular deadline go to die, because like as everyone who has wrestled with JavaScript knows, like it's hard. It's very hard to write bug-free software.
Right. To that point about sort of graphic libraries, you mentioned Django and Backbone all coming out, D3 coming out of, or at least partly coming out of the New York Times. I mean, I think the other one that comes to mind is Gregor Eisch was there for a long time, and I don't with DataWrapper, and I'm curious about your thoughts on DataWrapper, which I understand is currently using Svelte and SvelteKit. I'm just curious about like, I don't know, your thoughts on that and other toolkits using Svelte in, I don't know, even maybe ways that you hadn't foreseen. I'd be curious about that as well. Like, are there use cases that you've seen that you're like, oh, that's taking in a new or different direction?
There definitely are. I mean, so it's intensely gratifying that DataWrapper have been such enthusiastic supporters of Svelte, and actually they've been very enthusiastic financial contributors to Svelte as well. Like they've directly helped finance the work, and I'm particularly proud of that because Gregor is someone that before I worked at the New York Times, like kind of idolized, like part of the pantheon of like the great data viz practitioners. And now the company that he runs is like very closely involved with Svelte, and he's obviously a personal friend because we worked together at the Times. And so like I love to see that, and I'm biased, but I think they made a great technical choice as well. And yeah, it really makes a lot of sense in a context like that, because one of the things that component-based user interface frameworks like Svelte are really good at is giving you a way to describe things that are like, so you have this spectrum, right, between the things that are very much off the shelf and you have very limited control over how things work, and then at the far extreme you've got all of the flexibility, but you have to do all of the heavy lifting yourself. And that's where like intricate D3 based visualizations often sit, like the really impressive set piece stuff, like the stuff that wins awards. And in between, there's kind of this no man's land, or at least historically there was this no man's land. And component based frameworks kind of give you a structure for doing things that combine the reusable, drop-in templating stuff with the more bespoke. Okay, here are my little interactive flourishes and my annotations, which are really hard to do if you have a sort of configuration based or like template driven approach. And so if you're building a platform like DataWrapper, and there are others like evidence.dev is different audience, but like similar kind of idea. These things really lend themselves well to the component based philosophy that has taken over web development over the last decade. And so yeah, it makes a lot of sense. The more surprising uses I think are like Svelte has turned up on point of sale devices. In Latin America, it's turned up on smart TV interfaces and things like that, because it has this fairly small footprint and it can work on these lower powered devices. But gives people the ability to write interfaces that are responsive without having to like drop down and into the like the lowest levels of abstraction
Yeah.
and write this sort of very, very painful
Right.
and difficult
Detailed
to
code.
maintain
Yeah.
code. So yeah, it turns up in all sorts of weird places.
Yeah. How does that just I'm curious how that feels. So you're in newsrooms, you built this tool, presumably you sort of started I would guess with like inspiration like I could do my work better, and then it sort of spreads in the newsroom, and now there are conferences, there are televisions using it. Like, I'm just curious from your personal perspective, like how does that success make you feel? Because I'm also curious because uh it's not like Rich Harris. It's not like people use the Rich Harris framework, right? I mean, I'm sure many people know who are deep involved, but I'm curious from your just personal feeling about like how does it how does it feel like to have built something that so many people use every day?
Extremely weird. It is a very strange feeling, and it's something that's happened very gradually. Like I mentioned, that I've been working on this for 8 years, and in the beginning, very much toiling in obscurity. And for a long time, it was me and a bunch of friends just like hanging out on the internet, making this thing that we thought was cool.
Yeah.
And then gradually, it achieved escape velocity. Like it broke its containment and started becoming this thing that people who we had no connection with were using and were writing about. And then suddenly people are building educational material around this stuff. Like there are svelte YouTubers and things like
Yeah.
that. um and we tried to like be active in the community and like understand like who the people are who are using this stuff. But it's at a point now where like we can't possibly
Right.
have like a natural relationship with all of the people using this software. And every now and then we'll just sort of sit back and be like, oh wow, this is a thing. Like, when did that happen?
Right.
Yeah, it's strange. It is very flattering.
Hmm.
But it comes with a side of like, I don't know, I want to say like existential dread, because all of a sudden there's a responsibility. Like,
Yeah.
people have in many cases invested a lot in using this framework, and we need to make sure that those people are supported, that
Hmm.
they don't feel like they've made a terrible and regrettable decision. And in some cases, like, people are like, it's literally a significant part of people's livelihoods. Like, they're building companies on top of this framework.
Right.
Or they're selling um training courses, and they're doing workshops and stuff. And like, it kind of weighs on us. Like, you've got to be able to support that kind of thing.
But it also seems like because it's open source, it doesn't. I mean, it clearly doesn't. It's not like a Microsoft product, right? Where
Mhm.
I go to your shop and I buy your. I mean, it's open source, so like, and I totally understand what you're saying, that there's that level of responsibility of having created it, having brought it into the world. But do you also feel like that responsibility is also shared now by people who are using it?
It, yes and no.
Hmm.
Um, like, some people are real hardliners
Mm.
about this. The idea that open source is
Yeah.
is is a gift that you know I'm I'm not I'm not beholden to my users if I make some open source software.
Yeah.
Um, at the same time, I don't think that's really a truthful reflection of how it actually works in the real world.
Mm.
Um, just by virtue of the fact that you have put this thing out into the world, and I come on podcasts to talk about it, and like, we've spent a lot of time building a website that articulates the reasons that you would want to use this over some other thing. And when you do that, you're kind of making a an implied promise to your users that, like, this is a thing. Like,
Right.
we're proposing that you use this thing because we think that it's like a better choice than some of the alternatives. And to me, I don't think you can honestly do that without acknowledging that by doing so, you have put yourself in a position of saying, um, I am committing to some degree
Right.
to support you if you choose to use this. Like,
Yeah.
you're not just throwing it over the wall and letting people fend for themselves. And if you were, like, no one would use it.
Yeah. Right. So there's that I guess level of leadership that's sort of required as the original creator of something that people, like, I would guess to some extent people expect, and people probably want to some respect too.
Yes, I mean, people often imagine that because something is open source, everyone can just contribute, and like, but the maintainers are essentially fungible,
Yeah.
um, and that is just not how open source works at all. In reality, for a project to have a continued successful life, it needs to operate according to some sort of coherent philosophical worldview. Like, it needs to be moving in a particular direction.
Yeah.
Um, and the direction is set by the people who are actively contributing to the project, and it can change over time. But if you just replace those people, like if you replace the people who have been working with the project for many years with people who, are like, maybe they're very competent developers and maybe they're
Hmm.
very well intentioned people, but they bring to it a new set of ideas and a new set of requirements,
Right.
then all of a sudden you're not going in a consistent direction anymore.
Right.
And it becomes, like, people aren't going to want to use a piece of software that doesn't have a vision, that isn't moving
Right.
in a particular direction.
Yeah.
um, so yeah, I understand the point of view of someone who says, I created this software and I decided to gift it to the world, and it is,
I'm done.
as is, here is the MIT license.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
can refer to that, but beyond that, I owe you nothing. Like, I just don't subscribe to that view at all.
Yeah. So then on direction, um, maybe we could talk about Vercel a little bit, but just before we get to that, I'm curious if you uh, could kind of jack into the matrix and could supercharge your work on Svelte right now. Like, where do you see, would you like it to be, or where are you kind of directionalizing it over the next year? I mean, weeks, whatever time frame you're thinking about.
Well, the thing that keeps me motivated to work on this project is that web development is still way too hard.
Mm,
I believe that the web is a very important thing, and it's kind of under threat. It's under threat from a lot of different forces, um, not least the fact that people who use mobile devices actually don't use the web a whole lot.
hmm.
Um, People have lost the habit of using the web, and that is like a pretty perilous situation to be in when the alternative is proprietary app stores and closed ecosystems. And so, I want it to be very easy for people to build stuff on the web, and Svelte is the best way that um, I can work towards that goal. I also find that most software is kind of broken on the web and off the web. Like, a lot of software is just not particularly reliable.
Mm-hmm.
If you actually pay attention to how many times a day a piece of software doesn't do what it's supposed to do, it's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
Like, we have it. This is the infrastructure of our lives, and it's crumbling more so than our physical infrastructure. And I think that it should be easier, not just for people without deep technical backgrounds to be able to contribute to the web, but I think
Hmm.
people who are building on the web should be able to build reliable, bug-free software more easily than they are evidently doing today. And
Hmm.
so, if I could, like, press the fast forward button, 5 years from now, Svelte would be more accessible to more people. It would be easier to build reliable software, whether you're building something like for yourself, or you're building something in the context of a news article, at a on a website, or you're building a fully fledged application with a whole team of people building it. That is the stuff that I think we really need to strive towards.
Hmm. It's interesting listening to you talk about the direction because um, I think at least my outreach to you was really born out of the DataViz world, and clearly it sounds like that's where this whole project started, out of the graphics desks. Um, but when I hear you talk about it now, it it sounds and feels broader than just let's make good, better data visualizations. Let's make the web better. Let's make software better. And I'm curious, was there a point in the lifespan of the project where you either decided or realized that the project is moving beyond making better charts, graphs, interactives, and into something broader or something different? Or is that right from the get-go?
So Svelte was never conceived of as being solely for DataViz.
Mm-hmm.
DataViz just happens to be, in my view, one of the harder problems that you encounter
Yeah.
as a web developer, which is sort of ironic. Like a lot of the people who are working in DataViz are not programmers first and foremost. Like a lot of people learn JavaScript as a means to an end,
Yeah.
and that's even true. When you go to places like the New York Times, like the graphics department is full of, like, it's the most absurdly talented group of people that you could meet. But like a lot of these people have come from reporting backgrounds or design backgrounds, not programming backgrounds.
Yeah.
Um, and yet, when you're building interactive data visualizations, hard word, there's like a ton of data that you're dealing with, and you're trying to do like 60 frames per second animations, and there's interactivity coming from all different places. Like there's things that you tap on, and like you scroll, and things will adjust to show the next step of the exploration, and all of this stuff. Like this, I think, is a lot harder than building like your typical like dashboardy CRUD app, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so uh, there's it like Svelte was designed to be the sort of general purpose web framework, but it was designed to be usable by people who are doing pretty hard things on a tight deadline.
Yeah.
And that imposes, I think, certain technical and design constraints on
Mhm.
how you go about designing stuff. And it's my view that if you can solve that, if you can solve the hard cases, then well, you've also solved the easy cases without planning to.
Yeah.
And so over time, like I don't know, I guess we just noticed that more and more people were using it as a general purpose web development tool.
Right. So I'm curious about what you're doing now. You got this new gig, I think, last 4 or 5 years, something like that.
Yeah, just a little over 3 years, which is terrifying to think about. Like, time
time
really does
time
fly.
flies post pandemic.
It absolutely does. So yes, but for the last 3 years, I've been working on this essentially full time. When I was at the New York Times, it was kind of a side project. I would get some work hours to work on it, to the
Yeah.
extent that it was beneficial to the story that I was working on at that time. But now it is very much a full time gig, and that's enabled us to move a lot faster.
Yeah.
And the main focus right now is not Svelte itself, but the application framework that sits on top of Svelte called SvelteKit.
Hmm.
So for Svelte is the like the small, like the component um, building block type framework, and then SvelteKit is, okay, now what? Well,
Hmm.
I need to set up my build tooling and my dev server, and I need to deploy it somewhere, and I need to have like multiple different pages in my application. like Svelte doesn't solve those problems. So SvelteKit is the layer on top of that.
Mm.
And so right now, after spending a lot of time on the new version of Svelte, which was released towards the end of last year, we're now focusing a lot more on the application framework side of things, because that's where I think a lot of the difficulty arises when building applications. Is like, how do you think about getting your data from the server into the browser and then back again,
Mm-hmm.
and all those sorts of questions. So yeah, that's our current focus.
And when you release a new version, like you said at the end of last year, do you? I'm curious again, more not so much on the technical side, but on like the personal side. Like, is that a moment of dread for you? Is that a moment of pride? Like you mentioned earlier, like there's the hardliners. Like I'm curious, like when you press that button and it goes out to the world, are you like holding your breath? Like what is that? And I assume it takes a long time to get to that point where you're releasing an entirely new release. So like, what is that moment
There is a lot of breath holding.
like?
People don't like change.
Yeah.
People
Right.
love progress, but they hate change.
Yeah.
You know?
Right. Yeah.
We're very lucky in the community of people who use Svelte. A lot of them are like really engaged in what we're doing, and so when we release a stable version, that is the culmination of a process that's been going on for potentially a very long time. In the case of our recent Svelte 5 release, we'd been working on it for about 18 months.
Mm-hmm.
And people had been paying very close attention during that time. Some people had even been using the pre-release version in like their production applications, and so
Yeah.
they had been giving us a lot of feedback that whole time, which like helped us refine the design in a lot of different ways. We changed a lot of decisions that we'd made based on the feedback that we got from people. So by the time we released it, we had like a reasonably good idea of whether we'd made the right calls on certain things.
Yeah.
But there's still like this big unknown, like is like the great mass of developers going to warm to this, or are they going to think that we've completely lost our minds?
Yeah.
I'm happy to say that on the whole, the reaction has been very positive, but it's still always a very fraught time. And also, the minute that you release something stable, a lot more people start using it, which means a
Right.
lot more people start filing bugs and feature requests and all that sort of thing. So, you kind of imagine in the weeks leading up to a big release, like I'm working 14-hour days
Yeah.
and like I'm working myself to the bone, but it's okay because we're going to launch it and then we can take a week off.
Take a break.
And that is exactly not what happens. Like you launch it and then suddenly your workload increases
Right.
somehow. And so it wasn't really until Christmas that I think we were able to just truly breathe out and take
Yeah.
stock.
Wow. I want to I just want to finish up with one last question for folks who are listening to this, who, I mean, maybe they're programmers, maybe they're not. What would your recommendation be to them if they wanted to at least sort of dabble or think about getting started using Svelte in any of the things that we've been talking about? Like, where would you point someone first?
So we've tried to make it as approachable as possible, to the extent that we have this interactive tutorial that will teach you about Svelte, the language, and how to use it without you needing to install anything to your computer. So you can just go to svelte.dev/tutorial and you'll be walked through all of the different concepts that you need to learn, like one at a time in these very sort of bite-sized, manageable chunks. And then at the end of that, if you then want to build a Svelte application, then there is a command line tool that you can use. At that point, you do need to have some familiarity with, the terminal, and
Yeah.
ideally, you need to be able to use Node.js because, like, that is what SvelteKit runs on. And so at that point, you start to have slightly higher requirements. But in order to use Svelte itself and the playground on our website, you only really need to understand the basics of HTML and CSS, and like
Right.
the rest of it can sort of come gradually. So that is where I point people first: svelte.dev/tutorial. for the easy on ramp.
Terrific. Rich, this has been a lot of fun. I appreciate you taking your time and chatting with me for a bit. And I wish you the best of luck in the new year. I hope things have started to calm down a little bit, although I know early January is kind of the opposite of that. But I appreciate it so much and for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of the show. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you learned a lot. I hope you will check out Svelte and all the tutorials, as Rich mentioned, and a variety of other resources that you can learn about the tool over there. If you have a moment and can take a second to rate or review this show on your favorite podcast provider's platform, I would greatly appreciate it. Just click 5 stars. Even throw a little review if you like it that much. It really does help me find more guests and create better content for you. So until next time, this has been the PolicyViz podcast. Thanks so much for listening.